I'm Greg Smith, and over the next year I'll be your guide around the world and back and forth through the ages as we discover the Catholic story and how the Church has preserved the faith once and for all given to the saints.
Welcome to One Whirling Adventure's virtual pilgrimage to Ireland. Ireland, clothed in 100 different shades of green, surrounded by the deep blue sea. It's an amazing place, a mystical place, an enchanted place. In fact, I've never met anyone who visited Ireland that didn't come back charmed, enchanted. There's something profoundly, deeply special, and dare I say almost magical about this place. The island is stunningly beautiful, but it's more than just the natural beauty of the land. I mean, think about it. Norway has those gorgeous fjords, and Switzerland has those magnificent Alps. But I've never met anyone who came back from Norway and Switzerland and went on about how enchanted and charmed and magical the place was. I mean, they remark on the beauty of the land, but there's something special about Ireland. It's more than the land. It's the identity. It's the heritage. It's the culture of the place. It's the mixture of faith and suffering, of romance and tragedy. It's a complicated history being told by people with extraordinary gifts in literature and music and art. And for Catholics, it's known as the land of saints and scholars, because some of the Church's greatest saints and scholars came from the Emerald Isle. Over the centuries, Ireland has played some crucial roles during some of the Catholic story's most critical chapters, which is why it was inevitable that One Whirling Adventure would visit here. In fact, One Whirling Adventure will visit here more than once. I'll say about that in a moment. Because all of it began with one of the greatest missionaries the Church has ever produced, St. Patrick. Now, we're going to celebrate St. Patrick's Day by doing an entire episode on St. Patrick in just a few weeks. There won't necessarily be green beer and shamrocks and green hats. We're gonna tell the story of the greatest missionary saints that the Church ever produced, who has so much to teach us today. In fact, in that episode, I'll tell his story and share more about the missionary and evangelization lessons that he can teach us for reaching the world around us 1,500 years later. And we'll hear the story of how the Irish helped preserve the church and save Western civilization through the void that was left by the collapse of the Roman Empire. So make sure you tune in for that this St. Patrick's Day. But in this episode tonight, I want to take you on something of a travelogue, a lap around the island, hitting some of its major attractions, just as if we're taking a trip there together. But a bit of a warning first. You know, I've been asked many, many times by people, in fact, to take them on a pilgrimage to Ireland, to guide them on a tour there, or if they should go on a Catholic pilgrimage there. And what I've always said to them is that for Catholics, a pilgrimage to Ireland is very, very different than, say, a pilgrimage to Italy or France or Spain. And, you know, that's ironic because for a country whose heritage has been almost as Catholic as Italy's has been, or Spain's has been, there are simply fewer Catholic things to see in Ireland. And there are several reasons for that. First, you know, the greatest moments in Ireland's Catholic history were during the Dark Ages after the fall of Rome in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries. And the saints, Irish saints who did those, who made accomplished those great things, were monks who either lived very close to the land in relatively primitive monastic abbeys or structures, or isolated in small huts, or they were missionaries who left those abbeys and those small kind of clusters of huts, who sailed away from the island to bring the faith to distant lands. And when they did leave, the monasteries that did remain and stand were then raided in the centuries of the Viking invasions by the Northmen. And then after that, for centuries, Irish Catholicism was brutally repressed by an English Protestant government that occupied the island. Well, the net result of all of that is that this deeply Catholic place doesn't have Catholic, basilicas and cathedrals and monuments like in Italy or France or Spain that you can visit and marvel at. In fact, there's only one great Marian pilgrimage site on the island, and it's from an appearance of the Blessed Mother in 1879. So, a Catholic pilgrimage to Ireland is more about seeing a land and a people that was profoundly shaped by their Catholic faith, but lacks the Catholic monuments and sites to visit that some of those other countries have. A Catholic pilgrimage there is about being enchanted by a unique Catholic civilization that manifested itself in a unique culture. A Catholic pilgrimage to Ireland is about hearing the stories and seeing the sort of indirect fruits of its Catholic faith and identity. Wow. So, without much further ado, let's set off on a whirlwind tour of the island. Now, we're going to be taking a counterclockwise lap around the island, beginning with its capital city of Dublin. The city of Dublin lies on the Irish Sea on the southeast coast of the island, facing the west coast of Britain, facing towards Wales. Now, Dublin has traditionally been the direct port between southern Britain and Ireland, but it's also traditionally been a direct port to western France and Spain. And the connections of the Irish to those two countries has been significant over the centuries in various ways, particularly during times of the British Protestant oppression, because the Catholic countries of France and Spain were able to communicate and have exchanges with Ireland, which nurtured the Catholic faith in both directions. Now, Dublin lies on the mouth of the River Liffey. It's a seaport that gives access to the interior of the island, and for those reasons, it became the capital city of the nation of Ireland. Now, Dublin has always been a majority Catholic city, but because of the occupation of the island by the English Protestant government, Dublin lacks the sort of Catholic monuments, the great churches, cathedrals, shrines, Catholic museums, etc. that you would see in places like Italy, France, or Spain. It's a lovely walkable city along the river, but much of its architecture is also English, a sort of classic Georgian style. And so once again, you don't get the sort of Catholic flavor from the architecture and the buildings and the monuments that you would in those more traditional Catholic nations. But the culture of the city is uniquely Irish and uniquely Catholic, with live music in the pubs and a tradition of literary greatness. And at the center of this, and the uniquely Catholic sight to see in Dublin, is Trinity University, particularly its world-famous library. And in the library of Trinity University is one of the greatest treasures of the Catholic Middle Ages, the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells is an illuminated manuscript of the four Gospels, created in the 9th century by Irish Celtic monks. It is one of the great works of Christian faith from the Middle Ages, not only for its elaborate design and craftsmanship and dedication to the Word of God that it required, but its very creation and preservation is a testimony to the role that the written Word, particularly the Word of God, played in Irish Catholicism. During the early Middle Ages, the Irish fell in love with the written Word and with literacy. During a time when the written Word was disappearing in the centuries after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Irish became a unique people, like the Jews, that made a book, the Bible, the center of their identity. And that devotion to the written Word and literacy, even in a relatively poor agrarian society, contributed to the unique culture of the Irish. Now, the Irish were mostly poor and oppressed, living in a cultural backwater compared to the great events on the continent. But they were not culturally backward. And so the Irish became a profoundly literary people, and the Book of Kells and their devotion to the Bible formed their identity. 25 miles north of Dublin lies the Hill of Tara in County Meath. Now, Ireland is organized in counties, and County Meath was known as the Royal County because in pre-Christian times, the Gaelic clans would gather here to choose a new high chieftain for the island. The Hill of Tara was the center of pagan worship, where the Gaelic people believed their gods had their thrones. And so when the old high chieftain died, they assembled at Tara. They would gather around a stone pillar that still stands, the Stone of Destiny. There would be contests, feats of strength and combat on top of the hill, with the clans assembled below to choose the island's new high king. Now, Tara is interesting for Catholics for a couple of reasons. First, St. Patrick confronted the pagan Gaelic chieftains, near here, as it was the center of pagan and druidic culture. But more about that in our episode on St. Patrick. And also, when St. John Paul II visited Ireland in 1979, he held an open-air mass not far from Tara. They considered having him speak there, but there was a concern about the environmental impact of 300,000 people trampling the site. But 300,000 did gather in the fields for Mass not far from here, and another 750,000 gathered to hear St. John Paul II speak in Dublin that very evening. Now, if we drive just a dozen miles or so north of Tara, in the Boyne River Valley, we discover one of the wonders of the ancient world, but almost completely unknown to Americans, Newgrange. Newgrange was, or is, a prehistoric temple and astronomical calculator, and it is old. How old? It was built around 3200 BC. That is 5,200 years ago, 1,000 years before Stonehenge in England or the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Yes, I'll say that again, 1,000 years before Stonehenge or the Pyramids of Egypt. Now, Newgrange is a burial mound with internal chambers, and in that way, it's not unlike a pyramid. But it is like Stonehenge in that it is arranged in such a way with standing stones around it that it tracks the movement of the sunrise throughout the year. And in that way, it could track the seasons for planting and harvesting and no doubt cultural religious festivals based on marking the the solar equinoxes and solstices. So, for example, the central chamber, when you go inside of it, is aligned to light up on the morning of the winter solstice at sunrise, the shortest day of the year, to mark the turning of the year, the beginning of the progression towards longer days of spring and summer. Now, why would we come to Newgrange on a Catholic pilgrimage? Well, we couldn't possibly be in the area and not see something so interesting, of course. But it is a powerful reminder that the Druidic and warrior civilization that St. Patrick evangelized was ancient and sophisticated, which makes his rapid conversion of it even more remarkable. And again, I don't mean to keep teasing you, but more about that in the St. Patrick episode. Just a half dozen or so miles away from Newgrange along the Boyne River lies Monasterboice, just a few miles up the river from the Irish Sea. Monasterboice is the ruins of one of the Irish monasteries from the early Middle Ages, the kind of places that produced the Book of Kells. Monasterboice was founded in the late 5th century, so only 50 years or so after St. Patrick evangelized the island. What we see there now are two fascinating insights into medieval Irish Catholicism. The Round Tower was a defensive structure for the monks, built during the centuries of the Viking raids. You see, the Vikings roamed the coasts of the British Isles, and monasteries were among their favorite targets because of the gold sacramental vessels and other items of value that were stored there. Now, the Viking longships had shallow enough draws that they could sail up the rivers, and they could come right up the Boyne River to within a mile or so of the Monasterboice. So the monks could post a lookout in the top of this round tower, about 60 or 80 feet in the air, and retreat into it if they saw Vikings coming, pulling up the ladder when they were attacked. But it is the high crosses that are the real attraction here. The high crosses are great insights into the literary nature of Irish medieval Catholicism. They're richly carved with stories of scripture and saints. They remind us of why Ireland is so special. It is a place of faith, of tragedy, and artistic genius, all woven together to create a unique civilization that brings together the best of God and man's artistic longings and genius. Only 70 miles up the coast from the Boyne River Valley lies the capital of Northern Ireland, Belfast. In many ways, Irish history for the last 500 years has been the tale of two cities, Belfast and Dublin, because these are the two great port cities along the eastern coast of the island, which have trade and exchange, trade and travel with the rest of Great Britain. The counties around Belfast are the seat of English power on the island. The Republic of Ireland is a separate nation from Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom. And that's been the source of endless troubles and suffering and violence over the last 100 years. When the Republic of Ireland won its independence from England in 1921, the region of Northern Ireland was partitioned off because the population was about evenly split between Protestants and Catholics in these counties. Protestants didn't want to live under the rule of a new Catholic government in the south, and they appealed to the English crown to protect them. And thus, Northern Ireland was created. Now, led by the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, the Catholic half of Belfast and the northern counties fought to join the Catholic Republic. The Protestants fought back with their own militias, and the British brought in troops to protect the territory and their loyal British citizens. The effect was a long-running, low-grade civil war for decades. Visiting Belfast is a sobering reminder of how our religious identity can become so integrated with our political identity that faith can be one of the markers that divide us. Okay, we can't visit this part of Ireland without driving, say, 60 miles north to see the Giant's Causeway. Now, it has no religious or historic significance, but it's an amazing landmark and, frankly, pretty cool. How can you not want to see it? Geologically, the Giant's Causeway is a structure of 40,000 basalt pillars or columns that have eroded to form a flat surface of interlocking, roughly hexagonal geometric shapes. The basalt pillars grew into a hill, and over millions of years, weather and and the sea wore them down. And it's one of those special places, to visit and see and take photographs, and one of the iconic spots on the island of Ireland. We come now to the primary Marian pilgrimage site in Ireland, in the village of Knock. The evening of Thursday, August 21, 1879, was a very wet night. At about 8 o'clock p.m., it was raining as Mary Byrne, who was from the village of Knock, was going home with the priest's housekeeper, Mary McLaughlin. Now, Byrne stopped suddenly when she saw the gable of the church. She claimed that she saw 3 life-size figures. She ran home to tell her parents, and soon others from the village gathered. The witnesses said that they saw an apparition of Our Lady, St. Joseph, and St. John the Evangelist, the south gable end of the Church of St. John the Baptist. Behind them, and a little to the left of St. John, was a plain altar, and on the altar was a cross and a lamb with angels. A nearby farmer, about half a mile away from the scene, later described what he said was a large globe of golden light above and around the gable, circular in appearance. And for nearly 2 hours, a group that fluctuated somewhere between 2 and perhaps as many as 25 villagers stood or kneeled, gazing at the figures. It was raining the entire time. Now, this apparition over the centuries was investigated, or last century was investigated, and the best testimony about it is the fact that 5 different popes have honored it. Every pope from Pope Pius XII in 1945 has. Pope Pius XII contributed gifts. Pope John the 23rd contributed gifts. Pope Paul VI traveled to Ireland to lay the foundation for the shrine and basilica there. Pope John Paul II declared it a basilica, and Pope Francis visited when he was there a few years ago for the World Meeting of Families. Mother Teresa also visited there. And so Knock has become one of the most popular Marian shrines in Europe, along with Lourdes and Fatima. Almost 1.5 million people a year travel to the village of Knock, to the shrine of Our Lady of Knock. From the Basilica of the Shrine of Our Lady of Knock in County Mayo, we head out towards the coast to the imposing peak of Croa Patrick. Now, Croa is an ancient Gaelic word that means basically peak or mountain, and so it's essentially St. Patrick's Mountain. It stands high on the coast of County Mayo, overlooking the sea and the bays. The mountain is named after Patrick because it's said that he climbed it and fasted and prayed on top of it for 40 days and nights. Ever since, Croa Patrick has been an important pilgrimage site for Irish Catholics. There is a rocky road that leads from the base of the mountain along a ridge to the top. It's estimated that about 100,000 people a year climb Croa Patrick along this ridge. I did with my father 20-something years ago. But every July, on a special holiday called Reek Sunday, about 30,000 Catholics come there on pilgrimage. They climb the mountain in prayer and devotion. Many, or perhaps most of them, barefoot. Led by the local bishop, it's a way to express their devotion, to mortify their flesh, and offer themselves up in the spirit of St. Patrick for the Lord. Heading down the rugged and beautiful west coast of Ireland, we pass by the port city of Galway. There's no particularly important Catholic pilgrimage site in Galway. But other than it being a beautiful port town, it's also something of a sobering place. Because Galway was the departure point for so many Irish that had to leave the island during the famine and other exoduses. It was the place of saying goodbye to family, heading to the new world, realizing that you would probably never see your relatives again. Many of them headed out from Galway packed on ships in lower class passage, only to pass through by the Statue of Liberty through Ellis Island and to immigrate into the United States and other places. And so Galway and Galway Bay was the last look at home for so many Irish that spread out in the great diaspora of the Gaels. Continuing along the rugged and beautiful west coast of Ireland, we come to the Dingle Peninsula. The Dingle Peninsula is a photographer's dream. It's appeared in endless photos and film. The Dingle Peninsula is a photographer or cinematographer's dream, appearing in endless films and photographs. The scenery is breathtaking, but there's a sad story behind the Dingle Peninsula, and that is that it was in this area that many people suffered from the Great Potato Famine. Poor Irish Catholics, because of English agrarian policies, were forced onto rugged land. The only crop they could grow was potatoes. But when the potatoes failed, they began to starve. They couldn't eat the scenery. On Dingle, we encounter an ancient church called the Gallerist Oratory. The Gallerist Oratory dates from the decades right after St. Patrick, and it's constructed in the unique Irish fashion of dry stone construction. There's no internal frame or rafters. Stones are simply stacked in such a way that stones are symmetrically stacked in such a way that they have structural integrity. Stepping into this small stone church with only one small window and one narrow slit to look out onto the rugged coast, one imagines the weathers, the gales off the Atlantic that must have swept through. The Gallerist Oratory wouldn't have held more than a dozen people. And one can imagine a dozen Christians, perhaps a dozen monks, gathering in this small chapel to say the Mass. When people talk about visiting Ireland and the dramatic scenery and beauty of the island, they mention County Cary first. Rugged mountains, mountain lakes, meadows and rivers, a great national park. And at the center of County Cary is the town of Killarney. Killarney is today, of course, Killarney is a central tourist attraction because of its architecture, rugged beauty around it. Killarney captures almost everything that we love about Ireland. But we have one more stop to make on our pilgrimage. We head out from Killarney to the coast to visit the Skellig Islands. 12 miles off the coast in the Atlantic, at the westernmost point of what was Christendom during the early Middle Ages, is the island known as the Great Skelet, or Skellig Michael, named after the Archangel Michael. And at the top of this steep island, 600 or 700 feet in the air, is a small community of huts. This was a monastic community during the centuries of the Vikings. No more than a dozen monks lived here among the puffins, living lives of prayer, meditation, worship. They saw themselves in the tradition of St. Anthony of the Desert and the desert monks. They didn't have a desert to go to, but they had the sea. The drama of their faith and devotion is inspiring. At one time, they were essentially the church on the edge of the world. As I mentioned, in a few weeks, we're going to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, not with green beer and hats and shamrock, jackets or something, but by returning to the Emerald Isle to hear the story of St. Patrick and learn some lessons from that greatest of missionary saints. St. Patrick has so much to teach us today in Europe and the United States, and sadly in Ireland today. Because the sad truth is that the Catholic faith is collapsing in Ireland. Like Italy or Poland, Ireland was until recently one of the most reliably Catholic nations on the planet, with elements of and protections for the Catholic faith written into its constitution. But the story of Catholicism in Ireland is it's a cautionary tale. For complex reasons, the Catholic faith there unfolded in ways that left it badly prepared for the secular and neo-pagan waves that have swept over the Western world in the last few generations. The great accomplishments of Irish Catholicism, they took place during the the early Middle Ages. But as Catholic civilization began to flourish again on the continent in places like France and Italy during the High Middle Ages, the monastic structures of the Irish Catholic Church became kind of a cultural backwater. And at that time, it was still producing some of the church's most talented sons and daughters, for sure, great minds and great talents, great saints, but they largely left the island to pursue their careers or their missionary activities because Ireland wasn't the center of it wasn't one of the ecclesiastical centers of the church by that time. And when the Protestant Reformation came to England, Ireland was it was left in the crosshairs. I mean, think about it. The English monarchs became the heads of the Church of England, essentially their own popes with a national church. And the last thing that they wanted was an island full of Catholics allied with Spain at their back. And so the English monarchs began centuries of brutal repression through the Church of England of Irish Catholics. And in that long struggle, Catholicism became sort of inextricably woven into Irish nationalism. When you have what is perceived to be a foreign occupying force with another faith repressing your people and your faith, your patriotic sense, your national identity, your patriotism, your politics becomes entwined with your faith. Your faith becomes a marker, a symbol that differentiates you from the oppressors. And so for Catholics during that time, their Catholic identity essentially became indistinguishable from their political identity throughout their long struggle for independence. And so, you think about the troubles in Ireland with the Protestants versus the Catholics, and sometimes that's, I think, hard for Americans to understand, because it isn't just people arguing about theology or some points about Scripture. It's really two groups fighting for survival, and their faith becomes the way that you distinguish people and the way that your politics becomes identified. And so, people oppressed by a Protestant government formed, essentially upon independence, a more or less Catholic government. And Catholicism became a sort of cultural and political identity, perhaps more than a faith. And that, well, when you put the church in that position where it becomes this kind of powerful political force in a country, it becomes ripe for abuse and corruption. And the ordinary people could see some of the abuse and corruption in the Irish church, the Irish Catholic Church, especially in the 20th century. And that fostered a sort of resentment and hostility on the part of a lot of people towards the church. So when Ireland joined the global economy in the 1980s and 90s, and it became connected to the global culture through media and the internet and eventually in travel, well, many Irish people eagerly embraced secularism. There was this great falling away from the faith. For example, abortion had been banned by the Irish Constitution. But in 2018, it was legalized in a huge national referendum by a 2-to-1 vote. And there were great celebrations. In fact, if you watched those on television media, you saw people in the streets celebrating the sense that they were overthrowing the shackles that the Catholic Church had laid upon them. And since then, the LGBTQ agenda and gender identity politics has become widely endorsed. Last year, Ireland elected its first gay president, only the fourth nation in the world to have a gay head of state. And this is tragic for a nation that was, in some sense, a jewel in the Catholic crown. Well, all of that to say, Ireland, like the United States and Europe, needs a new evangelization. It needs a new missionary effort by the Catholic Church. But the good news is that the Irish people, and we, of course, can look to the great Irish missionary tradition, beginning with St. Patrick, for inspiration. So join me in our St. Patrick episode to learn how. Until then, thank you for your time, and let me leave you with a traditional Irish blessing.